Halloween panel discussion, Banquet for the Dead. My name is Habiba and I'll be your host today. We will just wait for a couple of minutes to make sure everyone has time to join. So let's wait for like 2 minutes and then let's start. Okay, I think it's time to begin. Let me first share my screen to have like a little intro. Okay. Can you see my screen?
All good.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Halloween panel discussion, Banquet for the Dead. Tonight's event brings together a panel of brilliant speakers, Julie, Martina, Irina, and Lillian, for a conversation that moves through history, culture, and belief to explore how humanity has always kept the dialogue between the living and the departed alive. We want to extend our deepest gratitude to our panelists who are generously volunteering their time to be with us tonight. Thank you. Thank you all for being here and sharing your insight and passion with our community. As always, we're so grateful for your brilliance and generosity. Thank you, everyone. Okay, let's start with saying what is SASA. SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Aligned. Our mission is to promote the study of the ancient and encourage engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work toward our goal of inspiring a wide and inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. We host a range of live events like this one, and master classes and reading groups and lectures, all aimed to connecting people with the wisdom and wonder of ancient history. This is what is SASA. And then stay connected with us. You can find Save Ancient Studies Alliance on all major social media, as you see the platforms. Follow us and stay up to date on future events and community opportunities and more fascinating exploration of the ancient world. And let's go with some housekeeping notes before we begin our discussion. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. If you're comfortable, please turn on your cameras. It helps create a sense of shared presence and community. Be kind and respectful of all voices in the conversation. Listen deeply and ask thoughtful questions. Your curiosity helps bring these topics to life. Please be patient and with technology and with those helping to run things behind the scenes. This event will be recorded and a link will be shared afterwards for all people are here. And of course, have fun. And if you enjoyed today's session, we would like to invite you to help support SASA. There are several ways to do so. Join our community of SASA supporters for as little as $5 a month. Subscribe on Twitch for $5 per month, or receive discounts on our SASA Bazaar, access to exclusive content, and more. Every bit of support helps us continue offering free, high-quality programming and keeping the study of the ancient world open to all. And with that, let's begin our session, Banquet for the Dead. We will close today with questions, and you will get the chance to do it. So please hold your questions or feel free to type them into the chat as we go. As we see around the world, people have always believed that feeding the dead is to convince they are never truly gone. That memory and love are forms of sustenance. So settle and let's explore together how culture across time have turned grief into ritual and ritual into remembrance. First, let's go to know our panelists a little more. I will invite them all to introduce themselves. Let's start with Julie. Julie, you have the mic.
Hello, my name is Julie Levy. I am an independent scholar, activist, and YouTuber. You can find me on the internet on Blue Sky and Mastodon and Twitch at Zillable, that's syllable with a Z, or on my YouTube channel, which is Zilla's Athenaeum. Um, I am a scholar of ancient Greece, and in particular of historical linguistics. And I am a former SASA member and very happy to be back for this occasion.
Thank you so much. Can we pass the mic to Martina?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, thank you to my fellow panelists as well for being here, of course. My name is Martina. I'm a postdoc in classics at the University of Johannesburg. So I am in South Africa, but I come from the Netherlands originally. I mainly focus on the Greek and Roman worlds, but my studies were a bit broader. So I also know some things about Greece and Egypt and the Middle East so far, and I think that would be good for this discussion here. And yeah, looking forward to it and great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now can we pass the mic to Lillian?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Lilian Céspedes González. I have a PhD in history from the University of Winchester in the south of England. The topic of my dissertation is just far too complicated to waste time here right now. But in theory, I'm a cultural scholar with a specialism in the Norse, the Middle Ages overall as a medievalist, gender studies, and culture, just to wrap it up. And I actually, like with Julie, I was part of the SASA team for some time. Very happy to be back here in the house as well. And perhaps you might have seen me in some other talks because we've done a lot of archeo tours in this channel. So that's what I actually normally do on my day job. Besides lecturing to the public, I'm actually a tour guide trying to get everybody to engage with history and culture in a way that is more sustainable and accessible for as many people as possible, which is why I'm delighted to be here, particularly with so many people that I know from many other projects, which is always a delight. So really, really good to be back.
Thank you so much. Now can we pass the mic to Irina? Hope
Yeah,
I'm
greetings
pronouncing
everyone.
it.
It's a pleasure to be here again. I am Irina. I'm a Viking studies scholar. I teach at Signum University a couple of modules on Old Norse civilization and culture. I'm particularly interested in pagan representations in Old Norse literature. Otherwise, I am also a research affiliate with the University of Chester, and I also have a history project called Shield of Skuld running on both YouTube and Substack, so public history, essentially.
This is great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your lovely introductions. And tonight we're setting the table not for the living, but for those who come before us, exploring how cultures across time have kept the conversation between the living and the departed alive through food, ritual, and remembrance. So let's begin this discussion with our first questions. That one that would help people to set the ground for the conversation, which is what are the feeding ritual in your culture or any culture that you know? Like here in Egypt, we have like so many like different rituals for feeding the dead. What about you guys? Do you know any culture that does this?
Certainly in ancient Greece, there are various methods of feeding the dead depending on what exactly you mean. If you're talking about some of the earliest Mycenaean tombs, we have trace evidence of entire jugs of food being left in the initial burial rituals. in the great Tholos tombs of Mycenae and the surrounding. Um, we don't know a ton about the details there, or at least I haven't heard any updates on that. But as you get further towards what we think of as ancient Greece and the classical periods, you start to hear about, I mean, primarily libations for the dead. The dead are always thirsty, in particular, and
Yes.
libations are pouring liquid offerings. So you pour water or wine or oil. Those are usually the three things. Or in the
Yes.
case of mythology, when you get to the dead shades, blood.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Yes, we also have this here in Egypt. We also offer, it's usually food, and I would really would really get to know why food, like of all mediums, light, art, and everything. Why especially food? Like why do humans so often choose food to bridge worlds? And why? What does that choice reveal about our relations to the body or the memory or to the dead? I mean, like why food? Have you ever thought about it?
I mean, we all eat, right? Every day of the week, no matter where we are, or at least we have a tendency of doing that. I like eating at least 3 times a day. Don't know about you guys. But I think that's actually perhaps one of the most common things that we see in intersectional archaeology and across the world, that our relationship to food from the very beginning of civilization since prehistory is what bounds us to this perhaps, I don't know if ancestral or existential need to feed the living and the dead. I think also something that resonates a lot with what Julie has just said, and that I particularly have found across specifically in a lot of Asian cultures, like Chinese and Korean cultures, is the idea of the spirits being hungry. And when the gates of hell
Yes.
open and potentially come into the world of the living, having that desperate need for consuming everything. So I guess that, just like your cousin at Thanksgiving, you just give them a good rice cake and hope that that will keep them busy for a while so that they don't eat you. Because I think that's normally what the fear of the dead not being fed normally leads us to believe, that if they've not been actually given something to consume, well,
Sung-
we will be the target, not necessarily physically, I don't think, in cannibalistic practices, although I guess we could argue from different cultures' perspectives, but particularly in the idea that, the spirits, ghosts, whatever will come and steal our life, energy, blood, whatever you want. And I guess that, at the end of the day, it's a very common human experience. So I think to the
Yeah.
very least, there is an anthropological reason for that somehow.
Yeah, I also
Thank you
think it's
so
a way
much.
to maintain community. I mean, you integrate and you keep the dead in the community of the
Yeah.
living. So it does have this aspect of social construction, and social construction means integrating both the living and the dead. And an interesting example just came to my mind from a medieval saga, but it does give us kind of like an idea of what was going on. The saga of the people of Eire. There is an episode with a gang of dead people. So some people who were drowned who actually take part in their own funeral feast, which is a pretty terrifying image. But when you think about it, it kind of resonates with this whole idea of integrating both the living and the dead. So they essentially come and occupy a space that is preserved for the living, and essentially these ghosts need to be banished, otherwise the community cannot function properly. But the main idea is, how do you keep the dead with you in a way that they don't disturb you, the living,
Yes.
and at the same time satisfying the ones who are gone. So, kind of like that.
Yeah, to kind
Yeah.
of speak to a couple of the things that have been said, including in chat, but also Lily and Irina have brought up some points that I was thinking about. You know, we have a large range of traditions even today, from the Mexican Dia de las Muertas, where you offer food, like favorite foods. You're trying
Yeah.
to entice your loved ones back to you when the veil is thin between the worlds. Um, to the placation of hungry ghosts in Japan, where there are these terrifying spirits that you want to kind of keep sated and away from you, but it exists sort of simultaneously, right? As there's the evil dead who are out to get you, and also the beloved dead, right? I'm So, among other things, I'm an Archeo gamer, and one of the games I'm playing right now is a Chinese-made game where you have this very Dia de los Muertos like Day of Memories.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me. And the whole idea of it is that the dead are drawn closer. Like, you try to make their favorite foods. You try to bring them into your life. It's more than just an abstract remembrance, right? It's almost a summoning.
It's like you're trying to pamper them so they don't ruin your life. Something like this.
Yes.
That too.
Yeah.
Yes, probably.
Well, but you might also want to have your grandmother come and say hi for an evening. That would be nice.
Yeah, probably.
Yes.
This is why, like, you would like offer her favorite food or something like this if you actually miss her. And actually, another perspective of this is probably we have in ancient Egypt this thought that we have the afterlife, and the afterlife is so similar to the life we're living today, and they have this thought that maybe it's offering food to the dead is like bringing them or offering them energy so they can go on with their life in the afterlife. It's like we're helping you to maintain a good healthy life even in the afterlife. This is how they see it in ancient Egypt. So okay,
Right.
yeah,
Oh, sorry.
please go ahead.
Well, I was just also thinking, it's one of the more well-known globally sort of funerary practices of, sending off the dead pharaoh with food and
Yes,
goods and
Yeah.
for the journey, right?
yes, it's like
Yeah.
it's like you're backing his backs to have this journey like and a well shaped like yeah. Okay, let's move
And I'm
to our
thinking,
next. Yeah, go ahead.
and
Yeah,
I'm
please go
thinking
ahead.
of another. I'm thinking of another example that shows how food was very important. It still is to us, but also in the ancient world. In Pompeii, for example, they found the tomb of the baker and his wife, and the baker was just a baker, but they built a massive tomb for him, where you can see the things like the oven and the breads all being part of the tomb. And I think that is very fascinating in the way that it shows that someone who was a baker, who was fairly simple, fairly low class in a
Yes.
way, was seen as so important that they built a massive tomb for him.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
this
was
is
also thinking of a connection. Sorry, maybe my last comment. I was thinking of something I've read recently about some ethnographic studies done on Finno-Ugric peoples. So the Kanti people, for example. And this is not, this is probably something very ancient, but this is stuff from like the 20th century. So some of the deceased, they were put in boats. And then on top of the boats, some house-like constructions were built, and they also had windows, and through this window you could like send the dead maybe a small token and also a little bit of food, a little bit of drinking, and you could like gather as a family there to commemorate your dead, but at the same time share that time with them. So I found this example very interesting because you essentially create this sort of like memorial context where you can link very well the living and the dead. So you can serve food, you can serve food for yourself, but at the same time you're basically drawing back the dead to your own world, or you keep in touch with them. Yeah.
Yeah, this is such an interesting point. Thank you for sharing this. Okay, any other comments? Okay, let's go. Yeah, let's move ahead. Okay, I mean, like feeding the dead assumed that they are still present somehow here, even if unseen. I mean, like, what forms of presence do these rituals imagine? Ghostly, ancestral, emotional? Have you ever thought about this? Like, is your grandma coming as a ghost? Or as a spirit? Something like this. Have you ever thought about this?
One thing that has been coming to mind as I think about my own traditions. In Jewish tradition, there's the dead are gone. There's you don't leave anything perishable. You don't even leave
Yes.
flowers. You leave stones. Um, so there's no tradition of feeding the dead as such, but there is one tradition that sort of evokes it, and that is on the Passover Seder, you leave a plate out for Elijah, the spirit of Elijah, um, who might come and visit your table. And that kind of you're not calling out to your own dead. You're not calling out to general dead, right? But you are leaving space for someone long gone to potentially bring the numinous, the divine, into your presence in that way, and specifically through inviting him to your table at possibly the biggest feast of the year. So there is some aspect of that, right? Of connecting to the divine in that way.
And if I
Yes.
may, something, because as Julie was just saying that obviously there are some relations, but represented in a completely different way. So I grew up in hyper-Catholic Spain, where the dead are never truly ever really dead, right? Either if you are Catholic, you either end up ascending into heaven, hopefully, unless you've been weird and you're trying to bargain for your soul in limbo, or you end up burning for all eternity in hell, which is, a wonderful prospect. Um, but in very in very Catholic tradition, the entire point of going to mass is that, well, you indeed commune with the body of Christ, which has risen back from the dead. Even on what we celebrate in Spain, which is the idea of All Saints, not Halloween or Samhain, but All Saints, which is on the 1st of November. The idea is going to a cemetery, and although the dead are not really believed to be around us, but more in an existential, metaphysical, religious way,
Yes.
connect with them so that they are aware that we are still thinking about them. And the idea of all of those masses that people in the Catholic Church, ever since Roman times, and particularly during the medieval period, the idea of buying so many masses so that people keep on praying for you, so that your memory is still alive, so that you're still connected with the people, and the constant act of the Holy Communion. In a strange way, I always say, Catholic people are constantly performing auto cannibalism. They are constantly consuming the body of Christ, which and drinking His blood, which I think in many ways takes us back to these farther ancient rituals of connection with our community. Of course, it's not a direct death in the way that perhaps we see it on a more day-to-day basis, but it is a metaphysical and religious death, which at the end of the day sets the precedent as to what we believe the afterlife is going to be like, and therefore what the lives of our beloved will be once they depart us. So I think there is something that goes around in that cycle somewhere, somehow.
Yeah, I definitely
Yes.
agree. And this reminds me, so as Lillian already said, so in the Roman Empire, for example, during pre-Christian times, you had all these memorial feasts going on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th day. This was also preserved not only in the Catholic Church, also in Orthodox churches, for example. This is something I grew up Orthodox, so this is also something that with the community I grew up with did and still does. But I wanted to point out that these sacrifices were transformed in the sense that they were sacrifices for the dead in pre-Christian times, but then the church was like, yeah, maybe it's not a good idea to sacrifice for the dead. Maybe we should change that, like sacrifice for the souls of the dead on the one hand,
Mhm.
or for the poor, something like that. So they really tried to transform it because, Christianity, but people were not listening, especially people in isolated communities or in rural communities. They were doing their thing. So, for example, we have a council in the 8th century, so Concilium Germanicum, which established that bishops should really prosecute pagan customs like sacrifice it to the dead, because it was no longer in accordance with the new faith. But that new faith actually allowed for such pagan remnants to survive in a way.
It's something that, just kind of going back to this, it and what you guys were saying earlier, just reminded me of actually a very strange tradition. I always thought it was weird, but you grow up with it, you just don't question it. It's what people do. In Spain, both for All Saints and for Easter, which at the end of the day, I guess is another funerary like rite, or funerary and rebirth. We have a sweet that becomes really popular in confectionaries, and I'm sure other countries must have something similar, which we call
We have a
huesos
pretzel.
de santo, which is saint's bones. And they are literally like teeny tiny pastries filled normally with some kind of um, sugary content and glaze or whatever. And they are literally, built in such a way that you are quite consuming the
Mean.
bone of a saint, so to speak, which is it it seems to be, I don't know. I don't know if that kind of is our own idea of even keeping the dead inside us, with us, in a more modern
Yeah.
perspective. But it is definitely pagan, right? That's not necessarily a Christian or a monotheistic practice of any kind. That is something that is definitely associated with a much further right in many ways.
And to sort of
Yeah.
return to antiquity and what cultures thought of when they were doing these rituals, are the dead really with us? In most of ancient Greece, what you have this concept of the land of the dead as a place of disconnection from the things of the mortal world. There's a common idea that like the sun and moon do not shine on the land of the
Fun.
dead. Um, but also there is not sustenance in the land of the dead for the most part. The shades are thirsty. They don't like they're driven to drink from the river Lethet, like not just because they're forgetting their past, but because there's no other water, right? Like this is a barren realm, with one major exception mythologically, which is of course the pomegranate that Persephone eats from, that keeps her in the underworld. um so there's this sort of interesting, um the dead are penned in a way away from the world of the living, and in order to reconnect with them in in a specific way, you have to go to some extraordinary lengths. So in our mythology, we have, these catabases where heroes will go down to the edge of the underworld or even into it, and then offer sacrifice, usually libation, usually blood, um, at that kind of extreme. But the more everyday connection that you'd be able to do would be to pour a libation or make a sacrifice of an animal at the grave. Um, and so you can there's a physical place that is the underworld, because we have these gates that they thought of as places to actually go into the underworld, but there's also the spiritual connection at the gravesite. And it does depend on where and when. Of course, ancient Greece is a big
Yeah.
range of time and space. So they're different. Like, we don't have that kind of evidence for the Mycenaean tombs I was talking about, but in sort of what we think of as like classical or ancient Greece, you might find these sort of libations being performed. Like if you look at uh, the word the words of Aeschylus, the playwright, for instance, there are funerary rites of offering libation to the dead, the specific dead. Pardon me. Um, and you also get these sort of hauntings, as of the unquiet dead, of the shades coming back if they aren't
Mm.
placated, if they aren't properly buried. Um, and so that kind of duality, again coming back to the the malevolent dead versus the benevolent dead. Um, you do get that sort of dichotomy in ancient Greece as well, but the actual connection to the material world is kind of tenuous, and you have to like make it yourself. And I think Irina, earlier you mentioned the Roman tombs,
Yes.
where you can pour libation. I was reading something recently where it said that some of them have actual pipes for the specific purpose. So like there is something very serious and important to people about offering to specific dead.
Yeah, I can think about an example from the Viking world and also the pre-Viking world, so the Iron Age. So there are some cases sometimes where you have a burial mound, and right next to the burial mound, you have like these stone structures that look almost like boxes, like stone cysts, but then they are open on one side, and they're usually open on the side that from where you can see the mound. So it has been theorized that these structures might have actually been places where you could have made some offerings, or again, you could have maybe gathered with your community and engaged in some sort of feast or a similar performance. But it's very interesting if you look at them like in the landscape. Sometimes some cremated bones have been found on the site. Otherwise, they're usually kind of empty. So there is this whole discussion of what exactly the purpose was of these stone structures. But it's very interesting. Like if you look at the whole context, it's definitely something going on here, because they're very close to the mound, and there is this idea. This impression that you get that they were meant to be in direct connection to these mounds which were erected for the dead. So I find it also very interesting to think about.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of this. I'm super happy for this. Thank you. Go ahead, Julie. You were about to
Oh,
say
I just,
something.
take this with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert in this area, but one thing that I have read about in a lot of indigenous peoples, especially in Asia, in the islander communities, I believe, is the practice of, we were talking about, Lillian was talking about the transubstantiation, right? The literal consuming of metaphorical flesh of the dead. But in some places, when somebody passes away, that is a much more literal way to connect
Yes.
with a loved one who has passed, is to consume a small piece of their flesh, because we are, after all, just meat, like any other animal. And to literally take that connection into yourself can be a deeply spiritual thing, to connect with somebody and say that they will never be gone for you.
Yes. Okay, since we're talking about the offerings and everything, I just have like a question that I would love to hear thoughts about. I mean, like, have you ever imagined if an archaeologist years from now excavated our areas, offerings, our candles, our playlists, our online, yes, and digital memorials? What might they conclude about how we relate to this? Like, we're leaving candles and everything. Like, have you ever thought about this?
Yeah,
All
I
the
mean,
time.
yeah, I think simply based on our popular culture, archaeologists of the future may think that we are some kind of necrophages because we seem obsessed with it. We seem obsessed with
Yes.
dead things coming back to life, and the concept of death overall, right? In fact, something that I keep on being very aware of because I've recently been doing a lot of work and research on supernatural beings, specifically, related with the horror phenomenon, since, well, we're approaching the season, right? That's why we're all here today for, is that that we are obsessed as a society with our potential and inevitable death. And I don't know really if we've kind of in some way have changed just one practice to another that makes it look a bit more socially acceptable. Because, like what Irina was saying, and going putting things for the dead in a Christian tomb or in normal burials or just out in the street, it just doesn't seem appropriate, right? We have specific festivals or specific cultural events that happen in our own context to produce such effects, if that is part of our cultural values, like, for example, Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, or the Jesa festivals in Korea, and the sacrifices to the havens or all across Asia, and what have you not. But the reality is that I kind of feel that in some way we are all constantly consuming and relating to death. I don't know if perhaps because of our sociocultural paranoia of recent years of constant apocalypse, which seems to be in our in our mouths 24/7. I don't know if that's just because of, well, we have become people who, not necessarily, overall, but historically have lived longer as a community than our ancestors. We have this misconception that people in ancient times didn't live to old age. That's absolutely rubbish. And we have plenty of osteoarchaeology and other details that prove individuals live to old age. But of course, mortality, particularly in infants and women, was so high that the natality and mortality rates were just completely skewed. But that doesn't happen anymore, or not so much in our modern world, which kind of means that we are constantly thinking about death, but also a little bit detached from it. Because a great portion of us, I'm not going to say the whole world, because sadly that's not the case, but a great portion of us go through the majority of our lifetimes, at least reaching the age of 40 or 50, thinking that, well, death is something that happens to people who are 80, 90, 100, something like that, when in reality, death is on every single corner. We are ridden by diseases that we didn't have before, by climatological events which are, taking life away from us, by constant war and strife. And I think that's something, particularly in recent years, that have become so obvious, such a clear part of our panorama, that we can no longer ignore. So I think we have a very strange relationship, and hence why the feeling of necrophages, because you would either think either these people are obsessed, or they are constantly consuming death, or trying to find ways to kind of drench themselves in death to avoid it for as long as possible. Because we have this kind of proximity, but at the same time aberrance to it. While on the other hand, I really think our ancestors, particularly the farther back we look in history, prehistory specifically, lived much closer with the idea of death. Hence why many people were buried in the basements of their own houses, or in caves that they also lived in, which is completely different from what we do now, where our cemeteries and funerary homes are as far away from the center of town as possible, and therefore from, civilization, or people. So I think that's definitely something that archaeologists of the future will have a ponder about, and perhaps a freak out about. That's for sure.
Yeah, just to sort of build off of that, I think in particular right now we're in this moment of the extremely wealthy being extremely obsessed with death and immortality in a way that was perhaps not as possible previously. I mean, it's not that it was never it's not that it hasn't ever been a thing. Like you see stories about ancient Chinese emperors trying all sorts of magic to prevent their own demises and things like that. But we have right now this I'm going to call it a democratization of life extension. It's not really. It's only available to the most extremely wealthy. But if you look at some figures of modern pop culture, for instance, like Brian Johnson, who he's living basically a non-life in order to try and never die. Um, and that is something that I think if we manage to have an archaeologist look or an anthropologist look back at this is going to be very striking. In the way that we hear tales of an ancient Chinese emperor trying to eat mermaid flesh to live forever and think, oh geez, that is just a lot, right? So there's that. And then the other thing that I keep thinking is that in some ways, this is we have all of this wonderful modern medicine and communication that allows us to extend our lives in the richer parts of the world, like Lillian was saying. And at the same time, we are so culturally afraid of death in a way that has never really been possible before because it is so foreign. I think for those of us in the U.S. who are old enough to remember, it almost death is kind of like our this might be a controversial way of putting it, but when 9/11 happened and it was the first attack on American soil in forever, and everybody was just shaken in their privilege of safety, of disconnection from the war that was outside our borders until that point. Right? So it's when death intrudes, it is like that. It is outside, it is other in a way that it really hasn't been for most of human history. Um, there's so much death in even books from 100 years ago. You can see the shift in how we relate to people dying, how we expect people to survive.
Yeah, and
Yeah, my
what I would
question is,
say,
yeah, sorry.
yeah, okay. What I would add to that as well, with the idea that what Lillian was also saying, when you're about 30, 40 years old, you feel like that is still so far away. And then thinking about the archaeologist who will look back on us in, say, 1,000 or 2,000 years, look at the amount of fantasy and such at the moment, partly also inspired by ancient cultures. Yeah, but a lot also made up more recently, of course. And I think that also sort of relates to the idea that maybe we are obsessed with death in a way that for us it feels like it's still so far away, although anything can happen anytime. I can get hit by a car and that's it. Of course, we don't want that, but it can happen anytime. But I think because we feel like it is still so far away, that might be one of the reasons that there are so many of those thrillers and horror movies and series and fantasy and such. And also something else I was thinking about earlier, when looking at rituals related to death and how that archaeologist in the future might see it. What is common for funerals these days in Europe, especially if it's non-religious, it's just something fairly small in the funerary home, where at the end you offer tea and coffee with a slice of cake, which is something, and that idea of coming together and remembering the past, and in a way also goes back to the ancient Greeks having feasts and meals and even games to commemorate the dead person, and not in a way of seeing it as something very terrible has happened, but more in a way of happily commemorating together. What we still, the remainder of that is still meeting after the funerary service with some tea and coffee and cake. But these days, you can also add other things to the menu there, basically. And I am thinking now, asking what would the archaeologists say about that in 1,000 years. If they would pick up what there at such events, would they relate it to what the Greeks did, or would they relate it to anything else? I'm not sure, but I am thinking about it now.
I was actually thinking, yeah, because so in Greek tradition, there's the perdeipnon. So after the burial ritual at the third day after death, uh, the people come home to a feast. And this is, I read that and immediately thought of the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva, where not only do the mourners come home to a feast, but there's a whole week of the people around the family bringing them food so that they don't have to cook. Um, and like similarly thinking of something like an Irish wake where it's not even it's much more related to the celebrating the death. But the idea is to, we have to remember that we are alive, that we have to eat, that we can drink, that we can celebrate, or at least, be cared for by our community in this very physical, very visceral way.
And
I do think that's a
borrowing.
continuity.
Yeah, speaking of that, I also wanted to say that my impression is the same. Like, I think death nowadays has become extremely sanitized. Ancient peoples used to look up the dead like quite in an active manner. Like, if you look at the way, for example, settlements are organized in the Iron Age, they're usually sometimes the graves are very close to Bronze Age monuments, for example. So there was definitely this idea of seeking a continuity, so trying to construct a line of continuity, and linking more ancient memories to the present. And these, I mean, the cemeteries were really, really close to the settlements, really close to them, which is very bizarre for us because we have like this very clear separation. But ancient peoples, they didn't really have it. And we also have now like professional services taking care of the dead. That this would have been like Julie said, much more visceral experience for these people who are like actively involved. So it was one point. And the second point, which, I mean, to me, it is very bizarre. For example, the thought that after I die, somehow my Facebook profile is still going to be active, or if I don't delete it until now, until then. But in a way, it feels like this lack of closure, because some digital data from you is going to survive. With you can delete everything, but something will survive. So it seems to me like this is also an attempt to like extend your life, but a very bizarre way, which is very different than people used to do, because they had ceremonies, they had like a timing. They also had this very community, like close community, knit community that took part in it. But now we're extending it with this sort of like digital data, which is kind of like depersonalized, but at the same time, it is still a form of memory, I think, in a way, albeit a bizarre one.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of something I was thinking of earlier, which is consumption of the dead in a more metaphorical sense. We are currently in the age of bringing dead actors back to the screen,
Yeah.
right? Of giving the dead a version of life that they have no control over, right? Of regenerating people that we miss, for, I mean, right now for entertainment purposes, which is kind of weird, as a starting point, but that's where the money is, right? But that digital existence beyond us is also somewhat connected, I think, to the idea of like a like memory tablets in ancient Rome, where you have the face of the dead person that comes out every year, um, or uh, or the pictures on the altar at Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, right? Anybody who's seen Coco, even if they don't know Mexican tradition otherwise, the image of the dead people being present, even if no one living personally remembers that person anymore, their image being brought back into the family altar, right? So there is a precedent for the memorial Facebook page, like my father has. um but those things are alive in a way that they didn't used to be, in this sort of the sort of undead way, rather than living, and more easily violated in some ways. Like, Facebook profile can be hacked. And I bring up the example of my father's Facebook page. In fact, his Facebook page was hacked about a year after his death, and some spammer started sending ads to all of us who wish to remember him. It's an interesting liminal space that we're still exploring, how that relates to our mortality and our loss. I think if we can preserve that for a future archaeologist or anthropologist, they are going to have a very interesting time unpacking it. The digital nature of it being somewhat problematical for that, though.
I think this is something that I've been actually thinking about this since we said we were going to do this panel about I guess our understanding of what a banquet for the dead is. And actually, this is very much in line with what Brian Smith on the chat has said. By the way, thank you everybody who's been dropping messages. They've been really, really nice, and we are reading them, by the way. But it's the idea that actually all of these things that we do are not actually for the dead. Like, we are calling it a banquet for the dead, but in reality, the people that we're doing all of these things for are ourselves. They are a selfish thing that we do for ourselves, at least nowadays. I don't doubt that our ancestors at any moment in history, and definitely before the Industrial Revolution, truly did it for their departed, and the idea of either keeping them happy or away from them. But nowadays, particularly, all of these celebrations that we do, the same idea with a wake than a funeral than anything else, it is for the benefit of the people who are alive, not for the benefit of the people who have died. Because, well, the dead, unfortunately, they are indeed dead. If they are here with us, they are definitely not in the same way that any of us, right? So is that simply a new way that we have found of grieving, of extending our relationship with our dear departed through a social media, through a digital age that simply allows us to keep that comfort, that presence, perhaps more physical than, well, essentially burying grandma in the backyard? Is that a more socially acceptable or more technologically pro, whatever you want to call it, way of keeping them close with us for our own benefit? Or what is it that, like you said, what is it that we're hoping to achieve or explore with this? Because to some extent, like you said, the risk of fraud and impersonation and mistreating the memory and those grieving from that memory nowadays has just become very high. And we see it. I mean, Facebook is a very obvious example, right? But we see it with so many other things. Likewise, with this idea of, oh, let's bring something or someone that doesn't exist anymore into a digital platform through a, a virtual space, AI or whatever. And I guess the other thing in there that sort of proves that it's mostly for the living than for the dead is the idea of consent. Have the dead consented to any of us keeping all of these things of them so reachable, so accessible, so exploitable in a way? Back in the day, they got buried, and that was it. If you wanted to feed them and engage with them, you were doing it through the terms of them being underground or burned or whatever it was, and therefore having to go through the appropriate rituals and the appropriate means to bring them back to us or to manifest them with us. But I think it's a very, very strange, peculiar, maybe selfish, maybe not selfish being the right word, I don't know, but definitely self-attached or egotistic way that we have now to interact with our dead for the purpose of those who are left behind, really, in some ways. It seems very sad. I think I'm not prepared for the modern way that we are processing death, to be
It's
honest.
gotten very controversial since the application Sora 2 as well, because people have started doing very bizarre and unethical things with it. I mean, it's also about the temporal distance here. Okay, fine, you can play with whatever images you want of Cleopatra. If you want Cleopatra to work at McDonald's for some reason, do it. But there have been complaints, for example, from the part of the families of Robin Williams or George Carlin. I mean, people who are like they're recently dead, and that's not really ethical, and it's also a bit pointless. I mean, this also has to do a bit with our obsession of like keeping people alive for as much as possible, but just in very complicated and ethically irresponsible ways nowadays.
I do want to push back a little bit on the idea that this is sort of a universal detachment, though, because I do think that there is something to be said for the places where people do more traditional offerings, food that doesn't get eaten, food that is specifically set aside for the dead. Um, and I think that um, another of my sort of more controversial opinions, but I do think that the move in monotheism away from being able to directly contact your dead is actually part of that motion, and that not everywhere has followed it as closely, right? So you do get a lot of traditions in East Asia, for example, that still have ancestor worship, that still do connect to the dead, even if we have the scientific knowledge, right, that we do now. I don't think that's all that different from someone like Plato, right? Um, saying, like, what we see is kind of what there is. Like, there's not a huge change in the percentage of people necessarily who believe in a spiritual realm that is somewhere other than the world of matter. Um, but I do think that our traditions, especially in the more monotheistic dominated places, have moved us towards um, seeing the dead as something we can't touch, and that actually gives rise to a movement like spiritualism, right? Of these people who claim that these psychics, these frauds who claim that they can speak directly to ghosts, is that desire to see those who are departed never goes away, but it becomes more underground in places where it isn't part of the everyday culture. And I don't think that you get that as hard in places where there is still active ancestor worship or active ancestor offerings.
Yeah,
And I
speaking of
think
ghosts,
actually,
that's
sorry, go ahead.
okay. I just wanted to say, speaking of ghosts, in like you said, in monotheistic religions, I also think that we're dealing with an evolution here, because the dead at the beginnings of Christianity, at least, they were much more corporeal. Like, okay, we have all these examples from old Icelandic literature, the best known ones because they're very physical. You interact with them, but if you read, for example, the stories mentioned by Thietmar of Merseburg in his chronicles, he discusses some practices that he thinks were like at the confluence between Christianity and the pagan practices of the Slavs in the regions that we're talking about, the eastern part of the Holy Roman Empire. And he does have some pretty horrific stories about monks seeing people taking part in masses. So the monk wants to go to the church. It's very early in the morning, and when he wants to do that, he sees people rising from the dead and organizing like their own church mass, which is something, it's a terrible sight. And in one of these stories, the dead seem so disturbed by his presence that they end up burning him alive. So yeah, at the beginning, I think it would have been, the image would have been much more complicated, and with the passage of time, like, we have this more ethereal image of the ghost, which is popular nowadays as well. But at the beginning, I think this relationship to the dead would have also been a little more physical. Yeah.
Which I think brings us back to what Lillian was saying about horror, right? So we have these zombies which no longer have the spirit, the soul. We have ghosts which no longer have the corporeal, and then we have things like vampires who sort of inhabit this realm in between of you know they have to take sustenance from the living in order to maintain that half-life. And I think that is not a coincidence, right? Those all come from these various folklore traditions that span back uncountable centuries, and have slightly different incarnations all around the world. But we do have these ideas of spirits in Japan coming back when they're like these monsters that come from dead people who have a grudge to bear, right? They can be corporeal or not. And you have the jiangxi, the Chinese hopping vampires, right? which have that same weird relationship of parasiticism with living. So there's this tension between the corporeal and the incorporeal that I think is very central to this question.
And what you see
And
here in Africa and more traditional communities, that there are still quite a few, or even those living in modern communities do go back to their traditions quite often. What you still see is that there is also still a lot related to burial and such, and coming together with families, quite often also with sort of religious witch doctor type figures who believe that they are still in touch with the deceased person. Sometimes, as if, stories from what I've heard, people having sort of discussions with the deceased person through this sort of witch doctor figure. So you still see it here in Africa.
Yes.
yeah, I was actually gonna say that, I think that actually a lot of these perceptions that seem so modernized and detached are definitely Western perceptions. And then I
Yes.
guess, the other thing I was thinking, just as we were talking about this, is like I wonder what the comparison is, for example, with religions or belief systems that believe in reincarnation, because then of course death is only temporary. So surely
Yes.
it's not going to be the same relation or the same transition, right? You don't need to necessarily commemorate somebody that you, or not to the same extent, somebody that you believe is going to, well, eventually come back to you,
Yeah.
whether in the same form or in a different form or in the shape of the wind. I think that also is something that for sure makes that corporeal barrier between the two concepts very, very different in many ways, I suspect.
Yeah, it can also be very vague and ambiguous. I mean, when I read the Old Norse sources, for example, I mean, even the medieval ones, you have the idea of reincarnation, for example, with the hero Helgi Hundingsbani, and you also have the idea of heroes continuing to live in the grave, but then at the same time they're in Valhall. So when they want, they can come back and live in the mound, and when they want, they can go. They're summoned by Odin, and they have to go be the Einherjar of the gods. So it would have been, I think, much more complex, the way pagans would have imagined things and like the afterlife. And sometimes we can also see it in the landscape, for example. So we have the site of Gudme in Denmark, where there is a hypothesis that they would have tried to like represent the realm of hell in the landscape, which is very interesting. Like the graves are in a way close to the settlement, but at the same time they're separated by some rivers, which are kind of common not only in Norse mythology but also in all kinds of mythology. So it's something you can see cross culturally. But I
Yes.
think that there would have been a lot of diversity in the way people would have imagined the afterlife in general. So much beyond the written sources. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about just how common the reincarnation idea is, because you don't really want to believe that your dead are truly gone. You don't want to believe that
Yes.
this is it. This is all you get, right? It's hard to conceive of your own non-existence, um, however far away you might believe that to be. But you have in ancient Greece, for example, where you have this canonical afterlife of basically being penned in to Hades eternally. Um, you have all of these little mystery cults spring up that promise renewal and rebirth in some fashion. You have, the Eleusinian mysteries that talk about the cycle of Persephone and sort of a rebirth in that direction. Or you have the Orphic mysteries, which have, we have we have a gold tablet with literal instructions of, you'll see the spring of Lethe, do not drink from it, do not go near it, go to the water of memory, Nemosune, go to this lake and drink from those waters. And it's like, take a left turn here, and you'll be brought back to the earth. um and so even in the cultures with the sort of the strictest idea of once you're dead, there's this continual hope of renewal, hope of rebirth,
Yes.
hope of reincarnation, and that is true for every culture that I know enough about to have
And
an opinion on.
yes, and I guess this is why Lillian, when she said that doing these offerings and everything, it's selfish in some kind of ways. It's like us believing that these deaths are do truly exist. It's like, yes, it's kind of selfish because we're doing this to like to believe so that they are still there, that after we die we still have like afterlife and so on.
You coming at it from a more atheistic perspective, which is where I sort of personally sit. Um, I've always thought that funerals, like graduations, are for the living, for the people who are partaking in the ceremony. The person graduating is like, I'm finally done. The people who come to witness the graduation are there to celebrate. And that's sort of the deal with funerals, right? Is I might
Yes.
want to offer things to my grandmother, but if I don't have a way of confirming that I can reach her, which, as
Yes.
somebody who does not particularly believe in life after death of any kind, um,
Yes.
you know, that is for me to feel that connection, even if it looks like an offering. And I think both
Yeah.
things can be true, right? I think it can be true at the same time that these offerings are literally to the dead, but also for the living, in a
Yes.
way that I also think about. Just because everything is connected to me. Uh, I also think about this when you look at like Greek animal sacrifices, which are the most common type of Greek sacrifice. The myth there is that the first people to sacrifice actually tricked the gods into taking the parts that weren't edible so the people could eat the food.
Yes.
Um, right, and it's like, yeah, because you need that food. It's important to sustain the living. It's important to have the festival. It's important for the people who are there to engage in a ritual that they can take part in, that they can sustain themselves on. And whether or not Zeus is up there inhaling the smoke is kind of immaterial, right? Like,
Yes.
it can matter, but it's also, like, if he's not, it's
Mm.
okay.
This is
And
Um,
since we're okay, go ahead.
no, sorry, you
Whoever,
go ahead.
yeah, no, no, you go ahead.
This is something that I was thinking earlier, completely forgot about, and it's just come to me that actually, if you look across the world, and you pay attention to where we see these traditions of festivals that still commemorate the dead or procure for the dead, many of them are actually associated or right at the end of harvest season, which is not coincidental because, like Julie was saying, you need to
Yes.
feed whoever you need to feed, whether they are dead or alive. You need to feed them. You cannot do that in the dead of winter because you may not be alive at the dead of winter. You have to do it when you have the resources and where the resources still mean something to the community, and when they mean something and when you can spare them once again. Sure, you've just gathered your corn and you can give your grandma, your great grandmother, and a cousin that you never met, a cob each, or even more so because you're feeling generous and you have it. Ask me in the dead of February if I'm willing to depart with these things, and the answer most likely will be not. In fact, I cannot think of a single European, for sure, definitely not Central Asian, not East Asian culture that does something like that between January and March-ish. We have obviously other types of celebrations that are related to dying, but not necessarily celebrating the act of death. It's slightly different perhaps in the Southern Hemisphere because, of course, we go on a different cycle. But whichever way you see it, they are always corresponding with the moments in time when we are able and willing to feed our living and alive communities one way or another. And I think that's also a very important part of why perhaps why we share food and why we think of feeding them rather than, light a little candle, move on. You can light a candle any moment of the year,
Yes.
if you see what I mean. It's not necessarily so special, because of the very value that we have given to that resource simply for survival.
Yeah, this
And one
reminded me of
thing,
a formula
oh,
that's very often found in Old Norse literature, till árs og friður, like for the good year, like for the harvest. The good year
Mm-hmm.
is always the harvest, and for peace as well. And yeah, there is also this fascinating example with the king being sacrificed because there was like a famine or a bad harvest or whatever, in the Ynglinga saga. So there is definitely a connection there, and this poses also the question of when we find in archaeology, for example, like remnants of great sacrificial feasts involving animals, there is this question of whether this was actually a feast or was it like regular consumption. And I think this is also something sort of like vague, maybe ambiguous, because if you think about it, at the time, you wouldn't have the opportunity to consume meat that often. Usually people were consuming porridge most often. So when you had like this sort of great feast, grand feast, that was something sacred in itself, I think, like such an occasion. Yeah.
one thing that Lillian's point reminded me of is, the seasonality of it all, right? The ancient Greek funerary rituals could be any time of year, but they were mostly using preserved goods like oil or wine,
Yes.
or water, which can be got any time of year. Um, but one thing that was seasonal and specific to winter actually was the month of Gamelion, the marriage month. So weddings traditionally took place basically in February, and the food associated with weddings is like dried fruits and nuts. Um,
Yes.
and you do see some of that with grave goods sometimes, but the connection between a wedding ritual and a funeral is actually very strong in Greece. There's a strong through line of, if an unmarried person, man or woman, was buried, there's a strong attachment to making the funeral a little bit like a wedding. You see, the wedding, the lutrophos, the water carriers that you would use for ritual cleansing, placed on grave markers for unmarried men. You have this strong idea of like, if a person wasn't married in life, then they are married to death. And so that sort of, the idea of preservation of food and preserved goods, I think, has something to do with that connection.
Yeah. Since we've been talking about all day, and as much as I like, but let's move like to something else that I am very interested in, which is mourning. It's another ritual that like if you have ever been to like an ancient Egyptian tomb, you will find like mourning became like a job. Like mourners became a job by the new kingdom. And I mean, I wonder why this became like a part that is very essential that they start to hire mourners for it. Have you ever thought about it? Why? I mean, like if our loved ones are looking at want us to feel merged, maybe because we love them, but at the same time they would feel bad about this.
In
To know what you think about this.
we have examples again almost in every single European culture up until
Yes.
pre-industrialization and even up until the 19th century, and not just them. In some Asian countries this is done too, particularly in countries that have strong connections with tribalism, and even I believe in some Native American rights, but on a slightly different scale. And likewise, I'm pretty confident, although Martin probably would be able to correct me, in African traditions, not just the idea of hiring mourners, but hiring people who will literally wail and scream and tear their clothes and their
Yes.
hair
Yes.
and inflict themselves pain
Yes.
on
Yes.
behalf of the deceased, or not just the deceased but the family. I think, in of course, different countries and different cultures have specific connotations and contexts where, there are nuances, but overall, at least certainly in European traditions, it has very much to do with the idea of being remembered, and at the same time the screaming, which is often very much associated with Celtic rituals, with shouting away the evil spirits, to kind of protect that environment, right? Like, this is our dead, leave it alone, or more importantly,
Yeah.
potential dead person, do not come back, because look how upset we are about the fact that
Exactly.
you're gone. Please don't come and haunt us for the rest of our lifetimes. Thank you. But also the idea of the guarantee that they will be remembered and spoken of, because in so many of these cultures, and I'm really talking about this from a cultural rather than religious perspective, the dead have to be carried on in name. That's also why we have so many countries across the world that when somebody dies, the next child that is born inherits that name, right? So that we
The
have
name.
Yeah.
that continuum. It's that constant idea of, please remember me, please don't forget me, please, please, please. And of course, the problem, as I'm sure we are all aware of, is that not all families are in terribly good terms with their deceased. So you are left in this awkward space of, yeah, I don't particularly care that, Uncle Bob passed away, or we didn't have a great relationship, or whatever, and you may not necessarily want to perform that for them, but you feel culturally the obligation to do so. So then you have these professionals, so to speak, but the dead themselves, sometimes in their wills, and this becomes particularly prominent in the Middle Ages after the Black Death specifically. We already had it before, but specifically after the Black Death, the idea of, I don't care what circumstances I die under, please make sure that somebody comes and scream and yell for me, because it's a must. It's the only way I can be sure, and I pay it out of my pocket in my will and testimony, that this will happen for my own benefit on the afterlife. And I think that idea of the mourning, sort of, let's say, ritual, so to speak. I've read some psychological and sociological studies that also demonstrate that it's kind of like a community catharsis, to leave all that anxiety and fear and horrible feelings that we get right on the spot, so that they don't become
Yes.
disease
Yeah.
that can eat us inside out, or that we are less likely to have, the events that have happened so many times in the past, and that still happen, of, I don't know, a husband or wife or matrimony of any kind, one of the partners died, the other one is so ridden by grief, their immune system gets completely destroyed, a few months later they are also dead. So it's kind of, I think, both a preservation of the dead in the afterlife, but a self-preservation of our own sanity, um, happiness, and giving emotions the relevant space that they are due. Not the idea of freezing our grief, because if we do that, then, well, things will surely come later to haunt
Yeah.
us,
Get
to
out
haunt
of
us by
control.
literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Way it's a coping mechanism, like really a way of healing the social rupture. So in Finno-Ugric traditions, for example, it is said that this howling afterwards helps the souls travel to the underworld. And here again, we can notice a difference if we compare the present with the past, because in past societies, this again would have been like a communal experience. Nowadays, it's much more individualized. I think each and every
Yes.
one of us has its own
Yes.
their own particular
Wow.
ways of dealing with such
Grieving.
an experience. But Yeah,
Yes.
but in the past, that would have been like being with the community was like part of the deal. You would have helped both the community of the living and, like I said, the dead, like travel easier to the underworld. And I don't know. I mean, in Old Norse culture, it's very difficult to like see very concrete examples of that. Like this is something archaeology doesn't really help us with. But I do know of some Byzantine sources, for example, talking about how frightened the Byzantines were, where they were hearing the howling and the screaming of the Rus. So like this sort of like combination between Scandinavians and Slavs in that part of the world. So it would have had like this cleansing purpose to fulfill. Yeah.
Okay, as much as I would love for this discussion to last like for the whole day, I guess we need to move to the question. Thank you all. Thank you so much for our panelists for this beautiful exchange and discussion. There's so much to unpack about how food becomes a language between the two worlds. We have to move to the questions from the audience, so please write them down in the chat.
I think we may have lost you there for a moment, Habiba.
Yeah. You mean?
Just for a second. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we heard everything that you were.
Yeah, I don't think we heard the end of your sentence.
Yes.
Okay. I was that now we can move questions.
Yes.
Perfect.
Very good.
So I was talking to the audience already and write them down in the chat.
So one question that I see from earlier in the chat is Valerie asking, do many cultures feed their ancestors to ask them for mystical help, like in asking an ancestor to help them get rid of a haunting? And something that that springs to mind as a receptionist is if y'all have ever seen the movie Mulan, right?
Yes.
The it's obviously it's Disneyfied, it's westernized, it's sanitized in some very interesting ways, but the basic idea of praying to your ancestors for guidance is very common in many East Asian traditions and Chinese traditions specifically. So definitely that still persists and is ancient as well.
Nowadays in Korea, they still have this. They still go and they still offer and they still offer the dead on the altar and everything till this very moment.
And I don't know if it's exactly on the same terms or exactly in the exact same line that Valerie was mentioning, but even in the traditional celebration of Samhain, which is where we get Halloween from, the consumption of food or certain items of food that were specifically brought to the celebration were specifically done for divination purposes. So, for example, apples in Celtic traditions and the performance of Samhain specifically have to do with our connection to the other world. While, for example, hazelnuts, I believe it is, and if it's not hazelnuts, it may be chestnuts, but a autumn nut, no matter what, are associated with wisdom. So we see that historically many of these items will be introduced in the ritual while talking, intervening, using our connection to the dead in that moment in time to gain some kind of revelation, guidance, idea towards the future. The accuracy or relevance of the divination is a different story, but a lot of the time, in particularly from the point of view of Samhain and the Celtic traditions and Irish traditions, they seem to be related with again, items that are useful for the community. Is this going to be a hard winter? Is that comet that has passed over our heads going to come and destroy us in a couple of months? Are we going to be able to endure the next wave of invaders? Things like that. They're not necessarily selfish divinations, though we have some examples where they're a bit more self-serving for specific individuals, normally the people who actually host the ritual, if you see what I mean. But overall, that idea of feeding the dead in that specific moment to attempt that divination seems to again facilitate a communion between the two worlds for the greater good. I didn't want to use that word,
Yes.
but it is indeed for the greater good in that regards.
Yes.
Yeah, especially in
Yeah,
times
and-
of crisis.
I was
In times of
just going to
crisis,
add that.
yeah.
Sorry, the
Yeah,
lag makes
sorry.
that interesting.
I was
I'll
just
go
gonna
there.
I was just going to give an example that there's also in archaeology, like a theory that, for example, when you have like big amounts of cattle being sacrificed, they are generally associated with like these very big, large feasts happening in halls. But then you can also have something much more specific, like whole bodies of horses or even of dogs or pigs or whatever, placed in wetlands or wells. So this sort of like liminal space. And it's been theorized that maybe in these cases we're dealing with like more specific occasions rather than just these seasonal feastings. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah,
just going to
Zuri,
add
go
that
ahead.
in
Yeah.
Greek mythology, the the whole point of the difficulty communicating with the dead, right, in the sacrifice that you make to bring them into communication is for that sort of divination purpose. You can really ask them questions about what is to come and what is what is best to do.
Yeah, Norse
Yeah,
mythology
we have very
doesn't have to do with ancestry. It has to do with the dead in general. Like the dead are seen as those people who have a particular type of knowledge that can be made accessible by invoking them. I mean, we can even see Odin doing that when he summons from the dead the Volva in Voluspor. So the dead do have this power of giving you a particular type of knowledge. Yeah.
yeah. We have another question that is very interesting that I would love to ask each one of you. What foods would each of you like as an offering? This is a very interesting one. Yeah. Let's start with Martina. What kind of food would you like as an offering?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you so much. Yeah. What? I really need to think about it for a moment. Actually, I like very many things. I would say something that other people can also enjoy. Maybe cake and fruits. Yeah, and nuts. A nice combination of things. Yeah, with the nuts and dried fruits, of course. Also, going back to what you see in a number of ancient traditions as food that has been given to the dead. Maybe also, maybe I would like that also as a sort of reminder in a way that I'm interested, I'm fascinated by the ancient worlds. And yeah, it's things I like. And I'm sure many people who will be there will enjoy it and they can then have it on my
Yes.
behalf. But thank you. Very interesting
Yeah.
question.
This is so thoughtful of you. Thoughtful of you. You're thinking about like people living. This is so thoughtful. Okay. What about you, Arena? What food would you like as an offering?
So wait a minute. You mean at a funeral feast or at my own funeral? So I understand the question right. Yeah. God, I don't
No,
know. I'm going to stay ancient
Say
and
at
I'm
your
going to say
own funeral.
horse meat because there was like there would have been this assumption that when you perform this sort of sacrifice, you would have absorbed part of the power of these animals, and I sort of like level with that idea. So I would like to absorb that kind of power, and yeah, if it's about my own funeral, maybe I want other people to absorb that kind of power too. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, definitely from there. I did this. Sorry to say this. would be interested in horse. Okay, what about you, Julie?
I will consume the horse meat on your behalf. It'll be okay.
Same. I
Yeah.
volunteer.
Okay, what about you, Julie? What kind of food would you like to have?
So I actually kind of, the immediate thing that I thought when I saw this question was, you see those memes go around of like, okay, what of these categories would people use to summon you?
Right.
so
Yeah.
so I'm thinking more of like a, like the silly summoning ritual with like 5 offerings. And if you really want to get my attention, you probably need some red meat and something very sweet, probably chocolate, and maybe some figs,
Yeah.
fresh
That's
figs.
that's cool. Yeah. This is something that I would like to eat, honestly. Okay, what about you, Lillian?
See, I was just thinking about this from like a very, I guess, realistic perspective. All of my
Yeah.
favorite foods, I kind of feel that if you were to bring them to me, they will spoil really fast, and I would feel really inappropriate leaving that stink everywhere, or even having to make somebody consume my very own offerings. Like I don't think they would necessarily, you know. Uh, go down very well. And actually, Paulo Guzman just said cheese. And I was thinking, you know what? Cheese is
Yes.
a great offering because it will last
Yes.
for a really long time. It's definitely something that is like very tangible and corporeal, which I suspect in the afterlife you may miss. So a nice cheese would probably go down, very, very well. But I think it's also because the area where I come from is all, farmers, particularly dairy farmers. So it would definitely be a strong connection um, to to my people. But something that kind of goes really, back to my own roots and thinking about, this ritualistic food and whatnot. So the area of Spain where I come from, which is Cantabria, is the Celtic North. We were actually the very annoying people that kept the Romans at bay for the best part of half a century. And the Celts and the Cantabrian people specifically have a very strong connection with the yew tree and yew berries. And I think it would be particularly given, the time of the year and associations with the dead and dead people. I think, you know, yew berries specifically would make a nice offering because since I would be dead, they won't affect me. They will not kill me once again. So
Yeah.
thinking about what Irina was saying about that power and that ability to
Yes.
sort of bounce back, I think that may be a nice thing that could be very
Poison berries for the
personal.
dead.
Yeah. Why not? They are not gonna kill
Why
them.
not? They're dead.
So exactly, you're dead. So some cheese and yew tree berries could go very wrong though if somebody isn't aware of what they are. But yeah, I think that probably would be one. And another one, which again I think a lot of people that live in rough country and in mountainous country like myself, mushrooms. Both because mushrooms again are some things that we associate with this time of the year, but also
Yeah.
because of the fact that we've used mushrooms for so many generations and since antiquity as hallucinogenics and often to connect with the dead. So as
Yeah.
much as it's not necessarily something that I would do as a human being towards somebody who is dead, as a dead person, I think that would go down a treat for sure.
By
Thank
the
you
way, the
all for
ceremonial, just a small comment. The
yeah, go
traditional
ahead.
ceremonial food in Romania eaten at funerary feasts is something called coliva, which is like this mix of wheat berries, walnuts, and sugar, and it's kind of good. But maybe I want to change my
Yeah.
answer. I mean, this whole conversation made me reflect more on about my own ancestors. So
Yeah.
maybe I'm gonna change my answer from the horse meat to the
This is
traditional
something I
food.
would really enjoy. Sounds like something I would really enjoy. So
Yeah, more
supporting
than
this
horse meat,
decision.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the lovely discussion. Thank you everyone for your questions and your comments. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today for this journey across cultures, centuries, and afterlives. And of course, a heartfelt thank you to our panelists, Julie, Martina, Irina, and Lillian, for your insights, your stories, and your generosity in sharing your time with us. As we close, we may carry forward the spirit remembrance, whether it's through rituals, reflection, or simply sharing a meal with those we love. Thank you all for being part of our Banquet for the Dead, and have a wonderful Halloween. Bye bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Habiba.
Bye.
Thank you.